Chapter 60 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 60 The Expansion of the United States. The region of the world that displayed the most immediate and striking results from the new inventions in transport was North America. Politically, the United States embodied, and its constitution crystallized, the liberal ideas of the middle 18th century. It dispensed with state church or crown. It would have no titles. It protected property very jealously as a method of freedom, and, the exact practice varied at first in the different states, it gave nearly every adult male citizen a vote. Its method of voting was barbarically crude, and as a consequence its political life fell very soon under the control of highly organized party machines. But that did not prevent the newly emancipated population developing an energy, enterprise, and public spirit far beyond that of any other contemporary population. Then came that acceleration of locomotion to which we have already called attention. It is a curious thing that America, which owes most to this acceleration in locomotion, has felt it least. The United States have taken the railway, the river steamboat, the telegraph, and so forth, as though they were a natural part of their growth. They were not. These things happened to come along just in time to save American unity. The United States of today were made first by the river steamboat and then by the railway. Without these things, the present United States, this vast continental nation, would have been altogether impossible. The westward flow of population would have been far more sluggish. It might never have crossed the great central plains. It took nearly 200 years for effective settlement to reach from the coast to Missouri, much less than halfway across the continent. The first state established beyond the river was the steamboat state of Missouri in 1821, but the rest of the distance to the Pacific was done in a few decades. If we had the resources of the cinema, it would be interesting to show a map of North America year by year from 1600 onward, with little dots to represent hundreds of people, each dot 100, and stars to represent cities of 100,000 people. For 200 years, the reader would see that stippling creeping slowly along the coastal districts and navigable waters, spreading still more gradually into Indiana, Kentucky, and so forth. Then somewhere about 1810 would come a change. Things would get more lively along the river courses. The dots would be multiplying and spreading. That would be the steamboat. The pioneer dots would be spreading soon over Kansas and Nebraska from a number of jumping-off places along the great rivers. Then, from about 1850 onward, would come the black lines of the railways, and after that the little black dots would not simply creep but run. They would appear now so rapidly it would be almost as though they were being put on by some sort of spraying machine. And suddenly here and then there would appear the first stars to indicate the first great cities of 100,000 people. First one or two, and then a multitude of cities, each like a knot in the growing net of the railways. The growth of the United States is a process that has no precedent in the world's history. It is a new kind of occurrence. Such a community could not have come into existence before, and if it had, without railways it would certainly have dropped to pieces long before now. Without railways or telegraph it would be far easier to administer California from Pekin than from Washington. But this great population of the United States of America has not only grown outrageously, it has kept uniform. Nay, it has become more uniform. The man of San Francisco is more like the man of New York today than the man of Virginia was like the man of New England a century ago. And the process of assimilation goes on unimpeded. The United States is being woven by railway, by telegraph, more and more into one vast unity, speaking, thinking, and acting harmoniously with itself. Soon aviation will be helping in the work. This great community of the United States is an altogether new thing in history. There have been great empires before, with populations exceeding 100 millions, but these were associations of divergent peoples. There has never been one single people on this scale before. We want a new term for this new thing. We call the United States a country, just as we call France or Holland a country. But the two things are as different as an automobile and a one-horse shay. They are the creations of different periods and different conditions. They are going to work at a different pace and in an entirely different way. The United States in scale and possibility is halfway between a European state and a United States of all the world. But on the way to this present greatness and security, the American people passed through one phase of dire conflict. The river steamboats, the railways, the telegraph, and their associated facilities did not come soon enough to avert a deepening conflict of interests and ideas between the southern and northern states of the Union. The former were slave-holding states, the latter states in which all men were free. The railways and steamboats at first did but bring into sharper conflict an already established difference between the two sections of the United States. The increasing unification, due to the new means of transport, made the question whether the southern spirit or the northern should prevail an ever more urgent one. There was little possibility of compromise. The northern spirit was free and individualistic, the southern made for great estates and conscious gentility ruling over a dusky subject multitude. Every new territory that was organized into a state, as the tide of population swept westward, every new incorporation into the fast-growing American system, became a field of conflict between the two ideas, whether it should become a state of free citizens or whether the estate and slavery system should prevail. From 1833, an American anti-slavery society was not merely resisting the extension of the institution, but agitating the whole country for its complete abolition. The issue flamed up into open conflict over the admission of Texas to the Union. Texas had originally been a part of the Republic of Mexico, but it was largely colonized by Americans from the slave-holding states, and it seceded from Mexico, established its independence in 1835, and was annexed to the United States in 1844. Under the Mexican law, slavery had been forbidden in Texas, but now the South claimed Texas for slavery and got it. Meanwhile, the development of ocean navigation was bringing a growing swarm of immigrants from Europe to swell the spreading population of the northern states, and the raising of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Oregon, all northern farmlands, to state level, gave the anti-slavery North the possibility of predominance, both in the Senate and the House of Representatives. The cotton-growing South, irritated by the growing threat of the abolitionist movement, and fearing this predominance in Congress, began to talk of secession from the Union. Southerners began to dream of annexations to the south of them in Mexico and the West Indies, and of a great slave state detached from the North and reaching to Panama. The return of Abraham Lincoln as an anti-extension president in 1860 decided the South to split the Union. South Carolina passed an ordinance of secession and prepared for war. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas joined her, and a convention met at Montgomery in Alabama, elected Jefferson Davis President of the Confederated States of America, and adopted a constitution specifically upholding the institution of Negro slavery. Abraham Lincoln was, it chanced, a man entirely typical of the new people that had grown up after the War of Independence. His early years had been spent as a drifting particle in the general westward flow of the population. He was born in Kentucky, 1809, was taken to Indiana as a boy and later on to Illinois. Life was rough in the backwoods of Indiana in those days. The house was a mere log cabin in the wilderness, and his schooling was poor and casual. But his mother taught him to read early, and he became a voracious reader. At 17 he was a big athletic youth, a great wrestler and runner. He worked for a time as clerk in a store, went into business as a storekeeper with a drunken partner, and contracted debts that he did not fully pay off for 15 years. In 1834, when he was still only 25, he was elected member of the House of Representatives for the state of Illinois. In Illinois particularly, the question of slavery flamed, because the great leader of the party for the extension of slavery in the National Congress was Senator Douglas of Illinois. Douglas was a man of great ability and prestige, and for some years Lincoln fought against him by speech and pamphlet, rising steadily to the position of his most formidable and finally victorious antagonist. Their culminating struggle was the presidential campaign of 1860, and on the 4th of March, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated president, with the Southern states already in active secession from the rule of the federal government in Washington and committing acts of war. The Civil War in America was fought by improvised armies that grew steadily from a few score thousands to hundreds of thousands, until at last the federal forces exceeded 1,000,000 men. It was fought over a vast area between New Mexico and the Eastern Sea. Washington and Richmond were the chief objectives. It is beyond our scope here to tell of the mounting energy of that epic struggle that rode to and fro across the hills and woods of Tennessee and Virginia and down the Mississippi. There was a terrible waste and killing of men. Thrust was followed by counter-thrust. Hope gave way to despondency, and returned and was again disappointed. Sometimes Washington seemed within the Confederate grasp. Again the Federal armies were driving towards Richmond. The Confederates, outnumbered and far poorer in resources, fought under a general of supreme ability, General Lee. The generalship of the Union was far inferior. Generals were dismissed, new generals appointed, until at last, under Sherman and Grant, came victory over the ragged and depleted South. In October 1864, a Federal army under Sherman broke through the Confederate left and marched down from Tennessee through Georgia to the coast, right across the Confederate country, and then turned up through the Carolinas, coming in upon the rear of the Confederate armies. Meanwhile, Grant held Lee before Richmond until Sherman closed on him. On April 9, 1865, Lee and his army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and within a month all the remaining secessionist armies had lain down their arms, and the Confederacy was at an end. This 4-year struggle had meant an enormous physical and moral strain for the people of the United States. The principle of state autonomy was very dear to many minds, and the North seemed in effect to be forcing abolition upon the South. In the border states, brothers and cousins, even fathers and sons, would take opposite sides and find themselves in antagonistic armies. The North felt its cause a righteous one, but for great numbers of people it was not a full-bodied and unchallenged righteousness. But for Lincoln there was no doubt. He was a clear-minded man in the midst of much confusion. He stood for union. He stood for the wide peace of America. He was opposed to slavery, but slavery he held to be a secondary issue. His primary purpose was that the United States should not be torn into two contrasted and jarring fragments. When in the opening stages of the war, Congress and the Federal generals embarked upon a precipitate emancipation, Lincoln opposed and mitigated their enthusiasm. He was for emancipation by stages and with compensation. It was only in January 1865 that the situation had ripened to a point when Congress could propose to abolish slavery forever by a constitutional amendment, and the war was already over before this amendment was ratified by the states. As the war dragged on through 1862 and 1863, the first passions and enthusiasms waned, and America learned all the phases of war weariness and war disgust. The President found himself with defeatists, traitors, dismissed generals, tortuous party politicians, an adopting and fatigued people behind him, and uninspired generals and depressed troops before him. His chief consolation must have been that Jefferson Davis at Richmond could be in little better case. The English government misbehaved and permitted the Confederate agents in England to launch and man 3 swift privateer ships. The Alabama is the best remembered of them, which chased United States shipping from the seas. The French army in Mexico was trampling the Monroe Doctrine in the dirt. Came subtle proposals from Richmond to drop the war, leave the issues of the war for subsequent discussion, and turn, Federal and Confederate in alliance, upon the French in Mexico. But Lincoln would not listen to such proposals unless the supremacy of the Union was maintained. The Americans might do such things as one people, but not as two. He held the United States together through long, weary months of reverses and ineffective effort, through black phases of division and failing courage, and there is no record that he ever faltered from his purpose. There were times when there was nothing to be done, when he sat in the White House silent and motionless, a grim monument of resolve. Times when he relaxed his mind by jesting and broad anecdotes. He saw the Union triumphant. He entered Richmond the day after its surrender and heard of Lee's capitulation. He returned to Washington and on April 11th made his last public address. His theme was reconciliation and the reconstruction of loyal government in the defeated states. On the evening of April 14th, he went to Ford's Theatre in Washington, and as he sat looking at the stage, he was shot in the back of the head and killed by an actor named Booth, who had some sort of grievance against him and who had crept into the box unobserved. But Lincoln's work was done. The Union was saved. At the beginning of the war, there was no railway to the Pacific coast. After it, the railways spread like a swiftly growing plant, until now they have clutched and held and woven all the vast territory of the United States into one indissolute mental and material unity, the greatest real community, until the common folk of China have learned to read in the world. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 61 The Rise of Germany to Predominance in Europe. We have told how after the convulsion of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic adventure, Europe settled down again for a time to an insecure peace and a sort of modernized revival of the political conditions of 50 years before. Until the middle of the century, the new facilities in the handling of steel and the railway and steamship produced no marked political consequences. But the social tension due to the development of urban industrialism grew. France remained a conspicuously uneasy country. The Revolution of 1830 was followed by another in 1848. Then Napoleon III, a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, became first president, and then, in 1852, emperor. He set about rebuilding Paris and changed it from a picturesque 17th-century insanitary city into the spacious Latinized city of marble it is today. He set about rebuilding France and made it into a brilliant-looking, modernized imperialism. He displayed a disposition to revive that competitiveness of the great powers which had kept Europe busy with futile wars during the 17th and 18th centuries. The Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, 1825 to 1856, was also becoming aggressive and pressing southward upon the Turkish Empire with his eyes on Constantinople. After the turn of the century, Europe broke out into a fresh cycle of wars. They were chiefly balance of power and ascendancy wars. England, France, and Sardinia assailed Russia in the Crimean War in defense of Turkey. Prussia, with Italy as an ally, and Austria fought for the leadership of Germany. France liberated North Italy from Austria at the price of Savoy, and Italy gradually unified itself into one kingdom. Then Napoleon III was so ill-advised as to attempt adventures in Mexico during the American Civil War. He set up an Emperor Maximilian there, and abandoned him hastily to his fate. He was shot by the Mexicans, when the victorious federal government showed its teeth. In 1870 came a long pending struggle for predominance in Europe between France and Prussia. Prussia had long foreseen and prepared for this struggle, and France was rotten with financial corruption. Her defeat was swift and dramatic. The Germans invaded France in August. One great French army under the Emperor capitulated at Sedan in September. Another surrendered in October at Metz. And in January 1871, Paris, after a siege and bombardment, fell into German hands. Peace was signed at Frankfurt, surrendering the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to the Germans. Germany, excluding Austria, was unified as an empire, and the King of Prussia was added to the galaxy of European Caesars as the German Emperor. For the next 43 years, Germany was the leading power upon the European continent. There was a Russo-Turkish War in 1877-78, but thereafter, except for certain readjustments in the Balkans, European frontiers remained uneasily stable for 30 years. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 62 The New Overseas Empires of Steamship and Railway. The end of the 18th century was a period of disrupting empires and disillusioned expansionists. The long and tedious journey between Britain and Spain and their colonies in America prevented any real free coming and going between the homeland and the daughter lands, and so the colonies separated into new and distinct communities with distinctive ideas and interests and even modes of speech. As they grew, they strained more and more at the feeble and uncertain link of shipping that had joined them. Weak trading posts in the wilderness, like those of France and Canada, or trading establishments in great alien communities, like those of Britain in India, might well cling for bare existence to the nation which gave them support and a reason for their existence. That much, and no more, seemed to many thinkers in the early part of the 19th century to be the limit set to overseas rule. In 1820, the sketchy, great European empires outside of Europe that had figured so bravely in the maps of the middle 18th century had shrunken to very small dimensions. Only the Russian sprawled as large as ever across Asia. The British Empire in 1815 consisted of the thinly populated coastal river and lake regions of Canada and a great hinterland of wilderness in which the only settlements as yet were the fur trading stations of the Hudson Bay Company. About a third of the Indian Peninsula under the rule of the East India Company. The coast districts of the Cape of Good Hope inhabited by blacks and rebellious-spirited Dutch settlers, a few trading stations on the coast of West Africa, the Rock of Gibraltar, the island of Malta, Jamaica, a few minor slave labor possessions in the West Indies, British Guiana in South America, and on the other side of the world, 2 dumps for convicts at Botany Bay in Australia and in Tasmania. Spain retained Cuba and a few settlements in the Philippine Islands. Portugal had in Africa some vestiges of her ancient claims. Holland had various islands and possessions in the East Indies and Dutch Guyana, and Denmark an island or so in the West Indies. France had 1 or 2 West Indian islands and French Guiana. This seemed to be as much as the European powers needed, or were likely to acquire, of the rest of the world. Only the East India Company showed any spirit of expansion. While Europe was busy with the Napoleonic Wars, the East India Company, under a succession of governors-general, was playing much the same role in India that had been played before by Turkoman and such-like invaders from the north. And after the Peace of Vienna it went on, levying its revenues, making wars, sending ambassadors to Asiatic powers, a quasi-independent state, however, with a marked disposition to send wealth westward. We cannot tell here in any detail how the British Company made its way to supremacy, sometimes as the ally of this power, sometimes as that, and finally as the conqueror of all. Its power spread to Assam, Sind, Oudh. The map of India began to take on the outlines familiar to the English schoolboy of today, a patchwork of native states, embraced and held together by the great provinces under direct British rule. In 1859, following upon a serious mutiny of the native troops in India, this empire of the East India Company was annexed to the British Crown. By an act entitled An Act for the Better Government of India, the Governor-General became a viceroy representing the sovereign, and the place of the company was taken by a Secretary of State for India, responsible to the British Parliament. In 1877, Lord Beaconsfield, to complete the work, caused Queen Victoria to be proclaimed Empress of India. Upon these extraordinary lines, India and Britain are linked at the present time. India is still the empire of the Great Mogul, but the Great Mogul has been replaced by the Crowned Republic of Great Britain. India is an autocracy without an autocrat. Its rule combines the disadvantage of absolute monarchy with the impersonality and irresponsibility of democratic officialdom. The Indian with a complaint to make has no visible monarch to go to. His emperor is a golden symbol. He must circulate pamphlets in England or inspire a question in the British House of Commons. The more occupied Parliament is with British affairs, the less attention India will receive, and the more she will be at the mercy of her small group of higher officials. Apart from India, there was no great expansion of any European empire until the railways and the steamships were in effective action. A considerable school of political thinkers in Britain was disposed to regard overseas possessions as a source of weakness to the kingdom. The Australian settlements developed slowly until in 1842 the discovery of valuable copper mines, and in 1851 of gold, gave them a new importance. Improvements on transport were also making Australian wool an increasingly marketable commodity in Europe. Canada, too, was not remarkably progressive until 1849. It was troubled by dissensions between its French and British inhabitants. There were several serious revolts, and it was only in 1867 that the new constitution, creating a federal dominion of Canada, relieved its internal strains. It was the railway that altered the Canadian outlook. It enabled Canada, just as it enabled the United States, to expand westward, to market its corn and other produce in Europe, and in spite of its swift and extensive growth, to remain in language and sympathy and interests one community. The railway, the steamship and the telegraph cable were indeed changing all the conditions of colonial development. Before 1840, English settlements had already begun in New Zealand, and a New Zealand Land Company had been formed to exploit the possibilities of the island. In 1840, New Zealand also was added to the colonial possessions of the British Crown. Canada, as we have noted, was the first of the British possessions to respond richly to the new economic possibilities that the new methods of transport were opening. Presently, the republics of South America, and particularly the Argentine Republic, began to feel, in their cattle trade and coffee growing, the increased nearness of the European market. Hitherto, the chief commodities that had attracted the European powers into unsettled and barbaric regions had been gold or other metals, spices, ivory, or slaves. But in the latter quarter of the 19th century, the increase of the European populations was obliging their governments to look abroad for staple foods, and the growth of scientific industrialism was creating a demand for new raw materials, fats and greases of every kind, rubber, and other hitherto disregarded substances. It was plain that Great Britain and Holland and Portugal were reaping a great and growing commercial advantage from their very considerable control of tropical and subtropical products. After 1871, Germany, and presently France and later Italy, began to look for unannexed raw material areas, or for Oriental countries capable of profitable modernization. So began a fresh scramble all over the world, except in the American region, where the Monroe Doctrine now barred such adventures for politically unprotected lands. Close to Europe was the continent of Africa, full of vaguely known possibilities. In 1850 it was a continent of black mystery. Only Egypt and the coast were known. Here we have no space to tell the amazing story of the explorers and adventurers who first pierced the African darkness, and of the political agents, administrators, traders, settlers, and scientific men who followed in their track. Wonderful races of men like the Pygmies, strange beasts like the Okapi, marvelous fruits and flowers and insects, terrible diseases, astounding scenery of forest and mountain, enormous inland seas and gigantic rivers and cascades were revealed. A whole new world. Even remains at Zimbabwe of some unrecorded and vanished civilization, the southward enterprise of an early people, were discovered. Into this new world came the Europeans, and found the rifle already there in the hands of the Arab slave traders, and Negro life in disorder. By 1900, in half a century, all Africa was mapped, explored, estimated, and divided between the European powers. Little heed was given to the welfare of the natives in this scramble. The Arab slaver was indeed curbed rather than expelled, but the greed for rubber, which was a wild product collected under compulsion by the natives in the Belgian Congo, a greed exacerbated by the clash of inexperienced European administrators with the native population, led to horrible atrocities. No European power has perfectly clean hands in this matter. We cannot tell here in any detail how Great Britain got possession of Egypt in 1883 and remained there in spite of the fact that Egypt was technically a part of the Turkish Empire, nor how nearly the scramble led to war between France and Great Britain in 1898, when a certain Colonel Marchand, crossing Central Africa from the west coast, tried at Fashoda to seize the Upper Nile. Nor can we tell how the British government first led the Boers or Dutch settlers of the Orange River district and the Transvaal set up independent republics in the inland parts of South Africa, and then repented and annexed the Transvaal Republic in 1877, nor how the Transvaal Boers fought for freedom and won it after the Battle of Majuba Hill, 1881. Majuba Hill was made to rankle in the memory of the English people by a persistent press campaign. A war with both republics broke out in 1899, a 3-year war enormously costly to the British people, which ended at last in the surrender of the two republics. Their period of subjugation was a brief one. In 1907, after the downfall of the imperialist government, which had conquered them, the Liberals took the South African problem in hand, and these former republics became free and fairly willing associates with Cape Colony and Natal in a confederation of all the states of South Africa, as one self-governing republic under the British Crown. In a quarter of a century, the partition of Africa was completed. There remained unannexed 3 comparatively small countries: Liberia, a settlement of liberated Negro slaves on the west coast; Morocco, under a Moslem sultan; and Abyssinia, a barbaric country with an ancient and peculiar form of Christianity, which had successfully maintained its independence against Italy at the Battle of Adowa in 1896. End of chapter 62. Chapter 63 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 63 European Aggression in Asia and the Rise of Japan. It is difficult to believe that any large number of people really accepted this headlong painting of the map of Africa in European colors as a permanent new settlement of the world's affairs. But it is the duty of the historian to record that it was so accepted. There was but a shallow historical background to the European mind in the 19th century, and no habit of penetrating criticism. The quite temporary advantages that the mechanical revolution in the West had given the Europeans over the rest of the Old World were regarded by people blankly ignorant of such events as the great Mongol conquests, as evidences of a permanent and assured European leadership of mankind. They had no sense of the transferability of science and its fruits. They did not realize that Chinamen and Indians could carry on the work of research as ably as Frenchmen or Englishmen. They believed that there was some innate intellectual drive in the West and some innate indolence and conservatism in the East that assured the Europeans a world predominance forever. The consequence of this infatuation was that the various European foreign offices set themselves not merely to scramble with the British for the savage and undeveloped regions of the world's surface, but also to carve up the populous and civilized countries of Asia, as though these people also were no more than raw material for exploitation. The inwardly precarious but outwardly splendid imperialism of the British ruling class in India, and the extensive and profitable possessions of the Dutch in the East Indies, filled the rival great powers with dreams of similar glories in Persia, in the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, and in further India, China, and Japan. In 1898, Germany seized Kiao Chau in China. Britain responded by seizing Wei-hai Wei, and the next year the Russians took possession of Port Arthur. A flame of hatred for the Europeans swept through China. There were massacres of Europeans and Christian converts, and in 1900 an attack upon and siege of the European legations in Pekin. A combined force of Europeans made a punitive expedition to Pekin, rescued the legations, and stole an enormous amount of valuable property. The Russians then seized Manchuria, and in 1904 the British invaded Tibet. But now a new power appeared in the struggle of the great powers, Japan. Hitherto Japan had played but a small part in this history. Her secluded civilization has not contributed very largely to the general shaping of human destinies. She has received much, but she has given little. The Japanese proper are of the Mongolian race. Their civilization, Their writing and their literary and artistic traditions are derived from the Chinese. Their history is an interesting and romantic one. They developed a feudal system and a system of chivalry in the earlier centuries of the Christian era. Their attacks upon Korea and China are an Eastern equivalent of the English wars in France. Japan was first brought into contact with Europe in the 16th century. In 1542, some Portuguese reached it in a Chinese junk, and in 1549, a Jesuit missionary, Francis Xavier, began his teaching there. For a time, Japan welcomed European intercourse, and the Christian missionaries made a great number of converts. A certain William Adams became the most trusted European adviser of the Japanese, and showed them how to build big ships. There were voyages in Japanese-built ships to India and Peru. Then arose complicated quarrels between the Spanish Dominicans, the Portuguese Jesuits, and the English and Dutch Protestants, each warning the Japanese against the political designs of the others. The Jesuits, in a phase of ascendancy, persecuted and insulted the Buddhists with great acrimony. In the end, the Japanese came to the conclusion that the Europeans were an intolerable nuisance, and that Catholic Christianity in particular was a mere cloak for the political dreams of the Pope and the Spanish monarchy, already in possession of the Philippine Islands. There was a great persecution of the Christians, and in 1638 Japan was absolutely closed to Europeans, and remained closed for over 200 years. During these 2 centuries, the Japanese were as completely cut off from the rest of the world as though they lived upon another planet. It was forbidden to build any ship larger than a mere coasting boat. No Japanese could go abroad, and no European enter the country. For 2 centuries Japan remained outside the main current of history. She lived on in a state of picturesque feudalism, in which about 5% of the population, the samurai or fighting men, and the nobles and their families, tyrannized without restraint over the rest of the population. Meanwhile, the great world outside went on to wider visions and new powers. Strange shipping became more frequent, passing the Japanese headlands. Sometimes ships were wrecked and sailors brought ashore. Through the Dutch settlement in the island of Deshima, their one link with the outer universe, came warnings that Japan was not keeping pace with the power of the Western world. In 1837, a ship sailed into Yedo Bay, flying a strange flag of stripes and stars, and carrying some Japanese sailors she had picked up far adrift in the Pacific. She was driven off by cannon shot. This flag presently reappeared on other ships. One in 1849 came to demand the liberation of 18 shipwrecked American sailors. Then, in 1853, came 4 American warships under Commodore Perry and refused to be driven away. He lay at anchor in forbidden waters and sent messages to the 2 rulers, who at that time shared the control of Japan. In 1854 he returned with 10 ships, amazing ships propelled by steam and equipped with big guns, and he made proposals for trade and intercourse that the Japanese had no power to resist. He landed with a guard of 500 men to sign the treaty. Incredulous crowds watched this visitation from the outer world, marching through the streets. Russia, Holland, and Britain followed in the wake of America. A great nobleman whose estates commanded the Straits of Shimonoseki saw fit to fire on foreign vessels, and a bombardment by a fleet of British, French, Dutch, and American warships destroyed his batteries and scattered his swordsmen. Finally, an Allied squadron, 1865, at anchor off Kyoto, imposed a ratification of the treaties which opened Japan to the world. The humiliation of the Japanese by these events was intense. With astonishing energy and intelligence, they set themselves to bring their culture and organization to the level of the European powers. Never in all the history of mankind did a nation make such a stride as Japan then did. In 1866 she was a medieval people, a fantastic caricature of the extremist, romantic feudalism. In 1899, hers was a completely westernized people, on a level with the most advanced European powers. She completely dispelled the persuasion that Asia was in some irrecoverable way hopelessly behind Europe. She made all European progress seem sluggish by comparison. We cannot tell here in any detail of Japan's war with China in 1894-95. It demonstrated the extent of her westernization. She had an efficient, westernized army and a small but sound fleet, but the significance of her renaissance, though it was appreciated by Britain and the United States, who were already treating her as if she were a European state, was not understood by the other great powers engaged in the pursuit of new Indias in Asia. Russia was pushing down through Manchuria to Korea. France was already established far to the south in Tonkin and Annam. Germany was prowling hungrily on the lookout for some settlement. The three powers combined to prevent Japan reaping any fruits from the Chinese War. She was exhausted by the struggle, and they threatened her with war. Japan submitted for a time and gathered her forces. Within 10 years she was ready for a struggle with Russia, which marks an epoch in the history of Asia, the close of the period of European arrogance. The Russian people were, of course, innocent and ignorant of this trouble that was being made for them halfway round the world, and the wiser Russian statesmen were against these foolish thrusts. But a gang of financial adventurers, including the Grand Dukes, his cousins, surrounded the Tsar. They had gambled deeply in the prospective looting of Manchuria and China, and they would suffer no withdrawal. So there began a transportation of great armies of Japanese soldiers across the sea to Port Arthur and Korea, and the sending of endless trainloads of Russian peasants along the Siberian Railway to die in those distant battlefields. The Russians, badly led and dishonestly provided, were beaten on sea and land alike. The Russian Baltic fleet sailed round Africa to be utterly destroyed in the Straits of Tsushima. A revolutionary movement among the common people of Russia, infuriated by this remote and reasonless slaughter, obliged the Tsar to end the war in 1905. He returned the southern half of Sakhalin, which had been seized by Russia in 1875, evacuated Manchuria, resigned Korea to Japan. The European invasion of Asia was coming to an end, and the retraction of Europe's tentacles was beginning. End of chapter 63. Chapter 64 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 64. The British Empire in 1914. We may note here briefly the varied nature of the constituents of the British Empire in 1914, which the steamship and railway had brought together. It was and is a quite unique political combination. Nothing of the sort has ever existed before. First and central to the whole system was the Crown Republic of the United British Kingdom, including, against the will of a considerable part of the Irish people, Ireland. The majority of the British Parliament, made up of the three united parliaments of England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland, determines the headship, the quality and policy of the ministry, and determines it largely on considerations arising out of British domestic politics. It is this ministry which is the effective supreme government, with powers of peace and war over all the rest of the empire. Next in order of political importance of the British states were the Crown Republics of Australia, Canada, Newfoundland, the oldest British possession 1583, New Zealand and South Africa, all practically independent and self-governing states in alliance with Great Britain, but each with a representative of the Crown appointed by the government in office. Next, the Indian Empire, an extension of the empire of the Great Mogul with its dependent and protected states reaching now from Baluchistan to Burma, and including Aden, in all of which empire the British Crown and the India Office, under parliamentary control, played the role of the original Turkoman dynasty. Then, the ambiguous possession of Egypt, still nominally a part of the Turkish Empire and still retaining its own monarch, the Khedive, but under almost despotic British official rule. Then, the still more ambiguous Anglo-Egyptian Sudan province, occupied and administered jointly by the British and by the British-controlled Egyptian government. Then, a number of partially self-governing communities, some British in origin and some not, with elected legislators and an appointed executive, such as Malta, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. Then, the Crown colonies, in which the rule of the British Home Government, through the Colonial Office, verged on autocracy, as in Ceylon, Trinidad and Fiji, where there was an appointed council, and Gibraltar and St. Helena, where there was a governor. Then, great areas of chiefly tropical lands, raw product areas, with politically weak and under-civilized native communities, which were nominally protectorates and administered either by a high commissioner set over native chiefs, as in Basutoland, or over a chartered company, as in Rhodesia. In some cases the Foreign Office, in some cases the Colonial Office, and in some cases the India Office has been concerned in acquiring the possessions that fell into this last and least definite class of all, but for the most part the Colonial Office was now responsible for them. It will be manifest, therefore, that no single office and no single brain had ever comprehended the British Empire as a whole. It was a mixture of growth and accumulations entirely different from anything that has ever been called an empire before. It guaranteed a wide peace and security. That is why it was endured and sustained by many men of the subject races, in spite of official tyrannies and insufficiencies, and of much negligence on the part of the home public. Like the Athenian Empire, it was an overseas empire. Its ways were seaways, and its common link was the British Navy. Like all empires, its cohesion was dependent physically upon a method of communication. The development of seamanship, shipbuilding, and steamships between the 16th and 19th centuries had made it a possible and convenient pax, the Pax Britannica, and fresh developments of air or swift land transport might at any time make it inconvenient. End of chapter 64. Chapter 65 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 65. The Age of Armament in Europe and the Great War of 1914-1918. The progress in material science that created this vast steamboat and railway republic of America and spread this precarious British steamship empire over the world produced quite other effects upon the congested nations upon the continent of Europe. They found themselves confined within boundaries fixed during the horse and highroad period of human life, and their expansion overseas had been very largely anticipated by Great Britain. Only Russia had any freedom to expand eastward, and she drove a great railway across Siberia until she entangled herself in a conflict with Japan, and pushed southeastwardly towards the borders of Persia and India to the annoyance of Britain. The rest of the European powers were in a state of intensifying congestion. In order to realize the full possibilities of the new apparatus of human life, they had to rearrange their affairs upon a broader basis, either by some sort of voluntary union or by a union imposed upon them by some predominant power. The tendency of modern thought was in the direction of the former alternative, but all the force of political tradition drove Europe towards the latter. The downfall of the empire of Napoleon III, the establishment of the new German Empire, pointed men's hopes and fears towards the idea of a Europe consolidated under German auspices. For 36 years of uneasy peace, the polities of Europe centered upon that possibility. France, the steadfast rival of Germany for European ascendancy, since the division of the Empire of Charlemagne, sought to correct her own weakness by a close alliance with Russia, and Germany linked herself closely with the Austrian Empire. It had ceased to be the Holy Roman Empire in the days of Napoleon I, and less successfully with the new Kingdom of Italy. At first, Great Britain stood as usual, half in and half out of continental affairs. But she was gradually forced into a close association with the Franco-Russian group by the aggressive development of great German navy. The grandiose imagination of the Emperor William II, 1888 to 1918, thrust Germany into premature overseas enterprise that ultimately brought not only Great Britain, but Japan and the United States into the circle of her enemies. All these nations armed. Year after year, the proportion of national production devoted to the making of guns, equipment, battleships, and the like increased. Year after year, the balance of things seemed trembling towards war, and then war would be averted. At last it came. Germany and Austria struck at France and Russia and Serbia. The German armies marching through Belgium, Britain immediately came into the war on the side of Belgium, bringing in Japan as her ally, and very soon Turkey followed on the German side. Italy entered the war against Austria in 1915, and Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in the October of that year. In 1916, Romania, and in 1917 the United States and China were forced into war against Germany. It is not within the scope of this history to define the exact share of blame for this vast catastrophe. The more interesting question is not why the Great War was begun, but why the Great War was not anticipated and prevented. It is a far graver thing for mankind that scores of millions of people were too patriotic, stupid, or apathetic to prevent this disaster by a movement towards European unity upon frank and generous lines, than that a small number of people may have been active in bringing it about. It is impossible within the space at our command here to trace the intricate details of the war. Within a few months it became apparent that the progress of modern technical science had changed the nature of warfare very profoundly. Physical science gives power over steel, over distance, over disease. Whether that power is used well or ill depends upon the moral and political intelligence of the world. The governments of Europe, inspired by antiquated policies of hate and suspicion, found themselves with unexampled powers, both of destruction and resistance, in their hands. The war became a consuming fire round and about the world, causing losses both to victors and vanquished out of all proportion to the issues involved. The first phase of the war was a tremendous rush of the Germans upon Paris and an invasion of East Prussia by the Russians. Both attacks were held and turned. Then the power of the defensive developed. There was a rapid elaboration of trench warfare until for a time the opposing armies lay entrenched in long lines right across Europe, unable to make any advance without enormous losses. The armies were millions strong, and behind them entire populations were organized for the supply of food and munitions to the front. Then was a cessation of nearly every sort of productive activity except such as contributed to military operations. All the able-bodied manhood of Europe was drawn into the armies or navies or into the improvised factories that served them. There was an enormous replacement of men by women in industry. Probably more than half the people in the belligerent countries of Europe changed their employment altogether during this stupendous struggle. They were socially uprooted and transplanted. Education and normal scientific work were restricted or diverted to immediate military ends, and the distribution of news was crippled and corrupted by military control and propaganda activities. The phase of military deadlock passed slowly into one of aggression upon the combatant populations behind the fronts by the destruction of food supplies and by attacks through the air. And also there was a steady improvement in the size and range of the guns employed and of such ingenious devices as poison gas shells and the small mobile forts known as tanks to break down the resistance of troops in the trenches. The air offensive was the most revolutionary of all the new methods. It carried warfare from 2 dimensions into 3. Hitherto in the history of mankind, war had gone on only where the armies marched and met. Now it went on everywhere. First the Zeppelin and then the bombing airplane carried war over and past the front to an ever-increasing area of civilian activities beyond. The old distinction maintained in civilized warfare between the civilian and combatant population disappeared. Everyone who grew food or who sewed a garment, everyone who felled a tree or repaired a house, every railway station and every warehouse was held to be fair game for destruction. The air offensive increased in range and terror with every month in the war. At last, great areas of Europe were in a state of siege and subject to nightly raids. Such exposed cities as London and Paris passed sleepless night after sleepless night while the bombs burst, the anti-aircraft guns maintained an intolerable racket, and the fire engines and ambulances rattled headlong through the darkened and deserted streets. The effects upon the minds and health of old people and young children were particularly distressing and destructive. Pestilence, that old follower of warfare, did not arrive until the very end of the fighting in 1918. For 4 years medical science staved off any general epidemic. Then came a great outbreak of influenza about the world which destroyed many millions of people. Famine also was staved off for some time. By the beginning of 1918, however, most of Europe was in a state of mitigated and regulated famine. The production of food throughout the world had fallen very greatly through the calling off of peasant mankind to the fronts, and the distribution of such food as was produced was impeded by the havoc wrought by the submarine, by the rupture of customary routes through the closing of frontiers, and by the disorganization of the transport system of the world. The various governments took possession of the dwindling food supplies, and with more or less success rationed their populations. By the 4th year, the whole world was suffering from shortages of clothing and housing, and of most of the normal gear of life, as well as of food. Business and economic life were profoundly disorganized. Everyone was worried, and most people were leading lives of unwanted discomfort. The actual warfare ceased in November 1918. After a supreme effort in the spring of 1918 that almost carried the Germans to Paris, the Central Powers collapsed. They had come to an end of their spirit and resources. End of chapter 65. Chapter 66 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 66 The Revolution and Famine in Russia. But a good year and more before the collapse of the Central Powers, the half-Oriental monarchy of Russia, which had professed to be the continuation of the Byzantine Empire, had collapsed. The Tsardom had been showing signs of profound rottenness for some years before the war. The court was under the sway of a fantastic religious impostor, Rasputin, and the public administration, civil and military, was in a state of extreme inefficiency and corruption. At the outset of the war, there was a great flare of patriotic enthusiasm in Russia. A vast conscript army was called up, for which there was neither adequate military equipment nor a proper supply of competent officers, and this great host, ill-supplied and badly handled, was hurled against the German and Austrian frontiers. There can be no doubt that the early appearance of Russian armies in East Prussia in September 1914 diverted the energies and attention of the Germans from their first victorious drive upon Paris. The sufferings and deaths of scores of thousands of ill-led Russian peasants saved France from complete overthrow in that momentous opening campaign, and made all Western Europe the debtors of that great and tragic people. But the strain of the war upon this sprawling, ill-organized empire was too heavy for its strength. The Russian common soldiers were sent into battle without guns to support them, without even rifle ammunition. They were wasted by their officers and generals in a delirium of militarist enthusiasm. For a time they seemed to be suffering mutely as the beasts suffer, but there is a limit to the endurance even of the most ignorant. A profound disgust for Tsardom was creeping through these armies of betrayed and wasted men. From the close of 1915 onward, Russia was a source of deepening anxiety to her Western allies. Throughout 1916, she remained largely on the defensive, and there were rumors of a separate peace with Germany. On December 29, 1916, the monk Rasputin was murdered at a dinner party in Petrograd, and a belated attempt was made to put the Tsardom in order. By March, things were moving rapidly. Food riots in Petrograd developed into a revolutionary insurrection. There was an attempted suppression of the Duma, the representative body. There were attempted arrests of liberal leaders, the formation of a provisional government under Prince Lvov, and an abdication, March 15th, by the Tsar. For a time it seemed that a moderate and controlled revolution might be possible, perhaps under a new Tsar. Then it became evident that the destruction of popular confidence in Russia had gone too far for any such adjustments. The Russian people were sick to death of the old order of things in Europe, of Tsars and wars and of great powers. It wanted relief, and that speedily, from unendurable miseries. The Allies had no understanding of Russian realities. Their diplomatists were ignorant of Russian, genteel persons, with their attention directed to the Russian court rather than to Russia. They blundered steadily with the new situation. There was little goodwill among these diplomatists for republicanism, and a manifest disposition to embarrass the new government as much as possible. At the head of the Russian Republican government was an eloquent and picturesque leader, Kerensky, who found himself assailed by the forces of a profounder revolutionary movement, the social revolution, at home, and cold-shouldered by the Allied governments abroad. His allies would neither let him give the Russian peasants the land for which they craved, nor peace beyond their frontiers. The French and the British press pestered their exhausted ally for a fresh offensive, but when presently the Germans made a strong attack by sea and land upon Riga, the British Admiralty quailed before the prospect of a Baltic expedition in relief. The new Russian Republic had to fight unsupported. In spite of their naval predominance and the bitter protests of the great English admiral, Lord Fisher, 1841 to 1920. It is to be noted that the British and their allies, except for some submarine attacks, left the Germans the complete mastery of the Baltic throughout the war. The Russian masses, however, were resolute to end the war, at any cost. There had come into existence in Petrograd a body representing the workers and common soldiers, the Soviet, and this body clamored for an international conference of socialists at Stockholm. Food riots were occurring in Berlin at this time, war weariness in Austria and Germany was profound, and there can be little doubt, in the light of subsequent events, that such a conference would have precipitated a reasonable peace on democratic lines in 1917 and a German revolution. Kerensky implored his Western allies to allow this conference to take place, but, fearful of a worldwide outbreak of socialism and republicanism, they refused, in spite of the favorable response by a small majority of the British Labour Party. Without either moral or physical help from the Allies, the unhappy, moderate Russian Republic still fought on and made a last, desperate offensive effort in July. It failed after some preliminary successes, and there came another great slaughtering of Russians. The limit of Russian endurance was reached. Mutinies broke out in the Russian armies, and particularly upon the northern front, and on November 7, 1917, Kerensky's government was overthrown and power was seized by the Soviets, dominated by the Bolshevik socialists under Lenin, and pledged to make peace, regardless of the Western powers. On March 2, 1918, a separate peace between Russia and Germany was signed at Brest-Litovsk. It speedily became evident that these Bolshevik socialists were men of a very different quality from the rhetorical constitutionalists and revolutionaries of the Kerensky phase. They were fanatical Marxist communists. They believed that their accession to power in Russia was only the opening of a worldwide social revolution, and they set about changing the social and economic order with the thoroughness of perfect faith and absolute inexperience. The Western European and the American governments were themselves much too ill-informed and incapable to guide or help this extraordinary experiment, and the press set itself to discredit and the ruling classes to wreck these usurpers upon any terms and at any cost to themselves or to Russia. A propaganda of abominable and disgusting inventions went on unchecked in the press of the world. The Bolshevik leaders were represented as incredible monsters, glutted with blood and plunder and living lives of sensuality, before which the realities of the Tsarist court during the Rasputin regime paled to a white purity. Expeditions were launched at the exhausted country. Insurgents and raiders were encouraged, armed and subsidized, and no method of attack was too mean or too monstrous for the frightened enemies of the Bolshevik regime. In 1919, the Russian Bolsheviks, ruling a country already exhausted and disorganized by 5 years of intensive warfare, were fighting a British expedition at Archangel, Japanese invaders in eastern Siberia, Romanians with French and Greek contingents in the south, the Russian Admiral Kolchak in Siberia, and General Denikin, supported by the French fleet in the Crimea. In July of that year, an Estonian army under General Yudenich almost got to Petersburg. In 1920, the Poles, incited by the French, made a new attack on Russia, and the new reactionary raider General Wrangler took over the task of General Denikin in invading and devastating his own country. In March 1921, the sailors at Kronstadt revolted. The Russian government under its president, Lenin, survived all these various attacks. It showed an amazing tenacity, and the common people of Russia sustained it unswervingly under conditions of extreme hardship. By the end of 1921, both Britain and Italy had made a sort of recognition of the communist rule. But if the Bolshevik government was successful in its struggle against foreign intervention and internal revolt, it was far less happy in its attempts to set up a new social order based upon communist ideas in Russia. The Russian peasant is a small, land-hungry proprietor, as far from communism in his thoughts and methods as a whale is from flying. The revolution gave him the land of the great landowners, but could not make him grow food for anything but negotiable money, and the revolution, among other things, had practically destroyed the value of money. Agricultural production, already greatly disordered by the collapse of the railways through war strain, shrank to a mere cultivation of food by the peasants for their own consumption. The towns starved. Hasty and ill-planned attempts to make over industrial production in accordance with communist ideas were equally unsuccessful. By 1920, Russia presented the unprecedented spectacle of a modern civilization in complete collapse. Railways were rusting and passing out of use, towns were falling into ruin, Everywhere there was an immense mortality. Yet the country still fought with its enemies at its gates. In 1921 came a drought and a great famine among the peasant cultivators in the war-devastated southeast provinces. Millions of people starved. But the question of the distresses and the possible recuperation of Russia brings us too close to current controversies to be discussed here. End of chapter 66. Chapter 67 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 67. The Political and Social Reconstruction of the World. The scheme and scale upon which this history is planned do not permit us to enter into the complicated and acrimonious disputes that center about the treaties, and particularly of the Treaty of Versailles, which concluded the Great War. We are beginning to realize that that conflict, terrible and enormous as it was, ended nothing, began nothing, and settled nothing. It killed millions of people, it wasted and impoverished the world, it smashed Russia altogether. It was at best an acute and frightful reminder that we were living foolishly and confusedly without much plan or foresight in a dangerous and unsympathetic universe. The crudely organized egotisms and passions of national and imperial greed that carried mankind into that tragedy emerged from it sufficiently unimpaired to make some other similar disaster highly probable so soon as the world has a little recovered from its war exhaustion and fatigue. Wars and revolutions make nothing. Their utmost service to mankind is that, in a very rough and painful way, they destroy superannuated and obstructive things. The Great War lifted the threat of German imperialism from Europe and shattered the imperialism of Russia. It cleared away a number of monarchies, but a multitude of flags still waves in Europe, the frontiers still exasperate, great armies accumulate fresh stores of equipment. The peace conference at Versailles was a gathering very ill adapted to do more than carry out the conflicts and defeats of the war to their logical conclusions. The Germans, Austrians, Turks and Bulgarians were permitted no share in its deliberations. They were only to accept the decisions it dictated to them. From the point of view of human welfare, the choice of the place of meeting was particularly unfortunate. It was at Versailles in 1871 that, with every circumstance of triumphant vulgarity, the new German Empire had been proclaimed. The suggestion of a melodramatic reversal of that scene in the same Hall of Mirrors was overpowering. Whatever generosities had appeared in the opening phases of the Great War had long been exhausted. The populations of the victorious countries were acutely aware of their own losses and sufferings, and entirely regardless of the fact that the defeated had paid in the like manner. The war had arisen as a natural and inevitable consequence of the competitive nationalisms of Europe, and the absence of any federal adjustment of these competitive forces. War is the necessary logical consummation of independent sovereign nationalities living in too small an area with too powerful an armament. And if the Great War had not come in the form it did, it would have come in some similar form, just as it will certainly return upon a still more disastrous scale in 20 or 30 years' time, if no political unification anticipates and prevents it. States organized for war will make wars as surely as hens will lay eggs, but the feeling of these distressed and war-worn countries disregarded this fact, and the whole of the defeated peoples were treated as morally and materially responsible for all the damage, as they would no doubt have treated the victor peoples had the issue of war been different. The French and English thought the Germans were to blame. The Germans thought the Russians, French, and English were to blame, and only an intelligent minority thought that there was anything to blame in the fragmentary political constitution of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles was intended to be exemplary and vindictive. It provided tremendous penalties for the vanquished. It sought to provide compensations for the wounded and suffering victors by imposing enormous debts upon nations already bankrupt. And its attempts to reconstitute international relations by the establishment of a League of Nations against war were manifestly insincere and inadequate. So far as Europe was concerned, it is doubtful if there would have been any attempt whatever to organize international relations for a permanent peace. The proposal of the League of Nations was brought into practical politics by the President of the United States of America, President Wilson. Its chief support was in America. So far, the United States, this new modern state, had developed no distinctive ideas of international relationship beyond the Monroe Doctrine, which protected the New World from European interference. Now suddenly it was called upon for its mental contribution to the vast problem of the time. It had none. The natural disposition of the American people was towards a permanent world peace. With this, however, was linked a strong traditional distrust of old world polities and a habit of isolation from old world entanglements. The Americans had hardly begun to think out an American solution of world problems when the submarine campaign of the Germans dragged them into the war on the side of the anti-German allies. President Wilson's scheme of a League of Nations was an attempt, at short notice, to create a distinctively American world project. It was a sketchy, inadequate, and dangerous scheme. In Europe, however, it was taken as a matured American point of view. The generality of mankind in 1918-19 was intensely weary of war and anxious at almost any sacrifice to erect barriers against its recurrence. But there was not a single government in the old world willing to waive one iota of its sovereign independence to attain any such end. The public utterances of President Wilson leading up to the project of a World League of Nations seemed for a time to appeal, right over the heads of the governments, to the peoples of the world. They were taken as expressing the ripe intentions of America, and the response was enormous. Unhappily, President Wilson had to deal with governments and not with peoples. He was a man capable of tremendous flashes of vision, and yet, when put to the test, egoistical and limited, and the great wave of enthusiasm he evoked passed and was wasted. Says Dr. Dillon in his book, The Peace Conference, Europe, when the President touched its shores, was as clay ready for the creative potter. Never before were the nations so eager to follow a Moses who would take them to the long-promised land, where wars are prohibited and blockades unknown. And to their thinking he was just that great leader. In France, men bowed down before him with awe and affection. Labor leaders in Paris told me that they shed tears of joy in his presence, and that their comrades would go through fire and water to help him to realize his noble schemes. To the working classes in Italy his name was a heavenly clarion at the sound of which the earth would be renewed. The Germans regarded him and his doctrine as their sheet anchor of safety. The fearless Herr Mühlen said, if President Wilson were to address the Germans and pronounce a severe sentence upon them, they would accept it with resignation and without a murmur and set to work at once. In German Austria his fame was that of a savior, and the mere mention of his name brought balm to the suffering and surcease of sorrow to the afflicted. Such were the overpowering expectations that President Wilson raised. How completely he disappointed them, and how weak and futile was the League of Nations he made is too long and too distressful a story to tell here. He exaggerated in his person our common human tragedy. He was so very great in his dreams and so incapable of his performance. America dissented from the acts of its president and would not join the League Europe accepted from him. There was a slow realization on the part of the American people that it had been rushed into something for which it was totally unprepared. There was a corresponding realization on the part of Europe that America had nothing ready to give to the Old World in its extremity. Born prematurely and crippled at its birth, the League has become indeed, with its elaborate and unpractical constitution and its manifest limitations of power, a serious obstacle in the way of any effective reorganization of international relationships. The problem would be a clearer one if the League did not yet exist. Yet that worldwide blaze of enthusiasm that first welcomed the project, that readiness of men everywhere, round and about the earth, of men, that is, as distinguished from governments, for a world control of war, is a thing to be recorded with emphasis in any history. Behind the short-sighted governments that divide and mismanage human affairs, a real force for world unity and world order exists and grows. From 1918 onward, the world entered upon an age of conferences. Of these, the conference at Washington called by President Harding, 1921, has been the most successful and suggestive. Notable, too, is the Genoa Conference, 1922, for the appearance of German and Russian delegates at its deliberations. We will not discuss this long procession of conferences and tentatives in any detail. It becomes more and more clearly manifest that the huge work of reconstruction has to be done by mankind, if a crescendo of such convulsions and world massacres as that of the Great War is to be averted. No such hasty improvisation as the League of Nations, no patched-up system of conferences between this group of states and that, which change nothing with an air of settled everything, will meet the complex political needs of the new age that lies before us. A systematic development and a systematic application of the sciences of human relationship, of personal and group psychology, of financial and economic science and of education, sciences still only in their infancy, is required. Narrow and obsolete, dead and dying moral and political ideas have to be replaced by a clearer and a simpler conception of the common origins and destinies of our kind. But if the dangers, confusions, and disasters that crowd upon man in these days are enormous beyond any experience of the past, it is because science has brought him such powers as he never had before, and the scientific method of fearless thought, exhaustively lucid statement, and exhaustively criticized planning, which has given him these as yet uncontrollable powers, gives him also the hope of controlling these powers. Man is still only adolescent. His troubles are not the troubles of senility and exhaustion, but of increasing and still undisciplined strength. When we look at all history as one process, as we have been doing in this book, when we see the steadfast upward struggle of life towards vision and control, then we see, in their true proportions, the hopes and dangers of the present time. As yet we are hardly in the earliest dawn of human greatness, but in the beauty of flower and sunset, in the happy and perfect moments of young animals, and in the delight of 10,000 various landscapes, we have some intimations of what life can do for us. And in some few works of plastic and pictorial art, in some great music, in a few noble buildings and happy gardens, we have an intimation of what the human will can do with material possibilities. We have dreams. We have at present undisciplined but ever-increasing power. Can we doubt that presently our race will more than realize our boldest imaginations, that it will achieve unity and peace, that it will live, the children of our blood and lives will live, in a world made more splendid and lovely than any palace or garden that we know, going on from strength to strength in an ever-widening circle of adventure and achievement. What man has done, the little triumphs of his present state, and all this history we have told form but the prelude to the things that man has got to do. End of chapter 67. Chapter 68 of A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chronological table. About the year 1000 BC, the Aryan peoples were establishing themselves in the peninsulas of Spain, Italy, and the Balkans, and they were established in North India. Knossos was already destroyed, and the spacious times of Egypt, of Thutmose III, Amenophis III, and Ramesses II were 3 or 4 centuries away. Weak monarchs of the 21st dynasty were ruling in the Nile Valley. Israel was united under her early kings. Saul or David or possibly even Solomon may have been reigning. Sargon I, 2750 BC, of the Akkadian Sumerian Empire was a remote memory in Babylonian history, more remote than is Constantine the Great from the world of the present day. Hammurabi had been dead 1,000 years. The Assyrians were already dominating the less military Babylonians. In 1100 BC, Tiglath-Pileser I had taken Babylon. But there was no permanent conquest. Assyria and Babylonia were still separate empires. In China, the new Zhou dynasty was flourishing. Stonehenge in England was already some hundreds of years old. The next 2 centuries saw a renaissance of Egypt under the 22nd dynasty, the splitting up of the brief little Hebrew kingdom of Solomon, the spreading of the Greeks in the Balkans, South Italy and Asia Minor, and the days of Etruscan predominance in central Italy. We begin our list of ascertainable dates with BC 800, the building of Carthage; 790, the Ethiopian conquest of Egypt, founding of the 25th dynasty; 776, First Olympiad; 753, Rome built; 745, Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Babylonia and founded the new Assyrian Empire; 722, Sargon II armed the Assyrians with iron weapons; 721, he deported the Israelites; 680, Esarhaddon took Thebes in Egypt, overthrowing the Ethiopian 25th dynasty; 664, Psammetichus I restored the freedom of Egypt and founded the 26th dynasty, to 610. 608, Necho of Egypt defeated Josiah, king of Judah, at the Battle of Megiddo. 606, capture of Nineveh by the Chaldeans and Medes, foundation of the Chaldean Empire. 604, Necho pushed to the Euphrates and was overthrown by Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar carried off the Jews to Babylon. 550, Kyrus the Persian succeeded Kexares the Mede. Kyrus conquered Croesus. Buddha lived about this time. So also did Confucius and Lao Tse. 539, Kyrus took Babylon and founded the Persian Empire. 521, Darius I, the son of Hystaspes, ruled from the Hellespont to the Indus. His expedition to Scythia. 490, Battle of Marathon. 480, Battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. 479, the battles of Plataea and Mycale completed the repulse of Persia. 474, Etruscan fleet destroyed by the Sicilian Greeks. 431, Peloponnesian War began, to 404. 401, Retreat of the 10,000. 359, Philip became king of Macedonia. 338, Battle of Chaeronea. 336, Macedonian troops crossed into Asia. Philip murdered. 334, Battle of the Granicus. 333, Battle of Issus. 331, Battle of Arbela. 330. Darius III killed. 323. Death of Alexander the Great. 321. Rise of Chandragupta in the Punjab, the Romans completely beaten by the Samnites at the Battle of Caudine Forks. 281. Pyrrhus invaded Italy. 280. Battle of Heraclea. 279. Battle of Ausculum. 278. Gauls raided into Asia Minor and settled in Galatia. 275. Pyrrhus left Italy. 264. First Punic War. Ashoka began to reign in Behar to 227. 260. Battle of Muli. 256. Battle of Ecnomus. 246. Shi Huangti became king of Qin. 220. Shi Huangti became emperor of China. 214. Great Wall of China began. 210. Death of Shi Huangti. 202. Battle of Zama. 146. Carthage destroyed. 133. Attalus bequeathed Pergamum to Rome. 102. Marius drove back Germans. 100. Triumph of Marius. Chinese conquering the Tarim Valley. 89. All Italians become Roman citizens. 73. The revolt of the slaves under Spartacus. 71. Defeat and end of Spartacus. 66. Pompey led Roman troops to the Caspian and Euphrates. He encountered the Alani. 48. Julius Caesar defeated Pompey at Pharsalos. 44. Julius Caesar assassinated. 27. Augustus Caesar Princeps until 14 AD. 4. True date of birth of Jesus of Nazareth. AD. Christian era began. 14. Augustus died, Tiberius emperor. 30. Jesus of Nazareth crucified. 41. Claudius, the first emperor of the legions, made emperor by Praetorian Guard after murder of Caligula. 68. Suicide of Nero, Galba, Otto, Vitellius emperors in succession. 69. Vespasian. 102. Pan Chao on the Caspian Sea. 117. Hadrian succeeded Trajan, Roman Empire at its greatest extent. 138. The Indo-Scythians at this time were destroying the last traces of Hellenic rule in India. 161. Marcus Aurelius succeeded Antoninus Pius. 164. Great Plague began and lasted to the death of M. Aurelius, 180. This also devastated all Asia. Nearly a century of war and disorder began in the Roman Empire. 220. End of the Han dynasty, beginning of 400 years of division in China. 227. Ardashir I, first Sassanid Shah, put an end to Arksakide line in Persia. 242. Mani began his teaching. 247. Goths crossed Danube in a great raid. 251. Great victory of Goths, Emperor Decius killed. 260. Sapor I, the second Sassanid Shah, took Antioch, captured the Emperor Valerian, and was cut up on his return from Asia Minor by Odenathus of Palmyra. 277. Mani crucified in Persia. 284. Diocletian became emperor. 303. Diocletian persecuted the Christians. 311. Galerius abandoned the persecution of the Christians. 312. Constantine the Great became emperor. 323. Constantine presided over the Council of Nicaea. 337. Constantine baptized on his deathbed. 361-63. Julian the Apostate attempted to substitute Mithraism for Christianity. 392. Theodosius the Great, Emperor of East and West. 395. Theodosius the Great died. Honorius and Arcadius redivided the empire with Stilicho and Alaric as their masters and protectors. 410. The Visigoths under Alaric captured Rome. 425. Vandals settling in south of Spain, Huns in Pannonia, Goths in Dalmatia, Visigoths and Suevi in Portugal and North Spain, English invading Britain. 439. Vandals took Carthage. 451. Attila raided Gaul and was defeated by Franks, Alemanni and Romans at Troyes. 453. Death of Attila. 455. Vandals sacked Rome. 470. Odoacer, king of a medley of Teutonic tribes, informed Constantinople that there was no emperor in the West. End of the Western Empire. 493. Theodoric the Ostrogoth conquered Italy and became king of Italy, but was nominally subject to Constantinople. Gothic kings in Italy, Goths settled on special confiscated lands as a garrison. 527. Justinian Emperor. 529. Justinian closed the schools at Athens, which had flourished nearly 1,000 years. Belisarius, Justinian's general, took Naples. 531. Chosroes I began to reign. 543. Great Plague in Constantinople. 553. Goths expelled from Italy by Justinian. Justinian died. The Lombards conquered most of North Italy, leaving Ravenna and Rome Byzantine. 570. Muhammad born. 579. Chosroes I died. The Lombards dominant in Italy. 590. Plague raged in Rome. Chosroes II began to reign. 610. Heraclius began to reign. 619. Chosroes II held Egypt, Jerusalem, Damascus, and armies on Hellespont. Tang dynasty began in China. 622. The Hegira. 627. Great Persian defeat at Nineveh by Heraclius. Taizong became emperor of China. 628. Kavad II murdered and succeeded his father Chosroes II. Muhammad wrote letters to all the rulers of the earth. 629. Muhammad returned to Mecca. 632. Muhammad died. Abu Bakr Caliph. 634. Battle of the Yarmouk. Muslims took Syria. Omar, second Caliph. 635. Taizong received Nestorian missionaries. 637. Battle of Qadisiyah. 638. Jerusalem surrendered to the Caliph Omar. 642. Heraclius died. 643. Ottoman, third Caliph. 655. Defeat of the Byzantine fleet by the Muslims. 668. The Caliph Muawiyah attacked Constantinople by sea. 687. Pepin of Herstal, mayor of the palace, reunited Austrasia and Neustria. 711. Moslem army invaded Spain from Africa. 715. The domains of the Caliph Walid I extended from the Pyrenees to China. 717 to 718. Suleiman, son and successor of Walid, failed to take Constantinople. 732. Charles Martel defeated the Moslems near Poitiers. 751. Pepin crowned king of the French. 768. Pepin died. 771. Charlemagne, sole king. 774. Charlemagne conquered Lombardy. 786. Harun al-Rashid, Abbasid, Caliph in Baghdad, to 809. 795. Leo III became Pope, to 816. 800. Leo crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the West. 802. Egbert, formerly an English refugee at the court of Charlemagne, established himself as King of Wessex. 810. Krum of Bulgaria defeated and killed the Emperor Nicephorus. 814. Charlemagne died. 828. Egbert became first king of England. 843. Louis the Pious died, and the Carlovingian Empire went to pieces. Until 962 there was no regular succession of Holy Roman Emperors, though the title appeared intermittently. 850. About this time Rurik, a Northman, became ruler of Novgorod and Kiev. 852. Boris I, Christian king of Bulgaria, to 884. 865. The fleet of the Russians, Northmen, threatened Constantinople. 904. Russian, Northman fleet off Constantinople. 912. Rolf the Ganger established himself in Normandy. 919. Henry the Fowler elected king of Germany. 936. Otto I became king of Germany in succession to his father Henry the Fowler. 941. Russian fleet again threatened Constantinople. 962. Otto I, king of Germany, crowned emperor, first Saxon emperor by John XII. 987. Hugh Capet became king of France, end of the Carlovingian line of French kings. 1016. Canute became king of England, Denmark, and Norway. 1043. Russian fleet threatened Constantinople. 1066. Conquest of England by William, Duke of Normandy. 1071. Revival of Islam under the Seljuk Turks, Battle of Melasgird. 1073. Hildebrand became Pope, Gregory VII, to 1085. 1084. Robert Guiscard, the Norman, sacked Rome. 1087-99. Urban II, Pope. 1095. Urban II at Clermont summoned the First Crusade. 1096. Massacre of the People's Crusade. 1099. Godfrey of Bouillon captured Jerusalem. 1147. The Second Crusade. 1169. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt. 1176. Frederick Barbarossa acknowledged supremacy of the Pope, Alexander III, at Venice. 1187. Saladin captured Jerusalem. 1189. The Third Crusade. 1198. Innocent III, Pope, to 1216. Frederick II, aged 4, King of Sicily, became his ward. 1202. The Fourth Crusade attacked the Eastern Empire. 1204. Capture of Constantinople by the Latins. 1214. Genghis Khan took Pekin. 1226. Saint Francis of Assisi died, the Franciscans. 1227. Genghis Khan died, Khan from the Caspian to the Pacific, and was succeeded by Ogdai Khan. 1228. Frederick II embarked upon the Sixth Crusade and acquired Jerusalem. 1240. Mongols destroyed Kiev, Russia tributary to the Mongols. 1241. Mongol victory in Liegnitz in Silesia. 1250. Frederick II, the last Hohenstaufen emperor, died, German interregnum until 1273. 1251. Mangu Khan became Great Khan, Kublai Khan governor of China. 1258. Hulagu Khan took and destroyed Baghdad. 1260. Kublai Khan became Great Khan. 1261. The Greeks recaptured Constantinople from the Latins. 1273. Rudolf of Habsburg elected emperor. The Swiss formed their everlasting league. 1280. Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China. 1292. Death of Kublai Khan. 1293. Roger Bacon, the prophet of experimental science, died. 1348. The Great Plague, the Black Death. 1360. In China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty fell and was succeeded by the Ming dynasty to 1644. 1377. Pope Gregory XI's return to Rome. 1378, the Great Schism, Urban VI in Rome, Clement VII at Avignon. 1398, Huss preached Wyclifism at Prague. 1414 to 1418, the Council of Constance, Huss burnt, 1415. 1417, the Great Schism ended. 1453, Ottoman Turks under Muhammad II took Constantinople. 1480, Ivan III, Grand Duke of Moscow, threw off the Mongol allegiance. 1481, death of the Sultan Muhammad II while preparing for the conquest of Italy. 1486, Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. 1492, Columbus crossed the Atlantic to America. 1498, Maximilian I became emperor. 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed round the Cape to India. 1499, Switzerland became an independent republic. 1500, Charles V born. 1509, Henry VIII, King of England. 1513, Leo X, Pope. 1515, Francis I, King of France. 1520, Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan, to 1566, who ruled from Baghdad to Hungary, Charles V's Emperor. 1525, Babur won the Battle of Panipat, captured Delhi, and founded the Mughal Empire. 1527, the German troops in Italy, under the Constable of Bourbon, took and pillaged Rome. 1529, Suleiman besieged Vienna. 1530, Charles V crowned by the Pope. Henry VIII began his quarrel with the papacy. 1539, the Society of Jesus founded. 1546, Martin Luther died. 1547, Ivan IV, the Terrible, took the title of Tsar of Russia. 1556, Charles V abdicated. Akbar, Great Mogul, to 1605. Ignatius of Loyola died. 1558, death of Charles V. 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent died. 1603, James I, King of England and Scotland. 1620, Mayflower expedition founded New Plymouth. First Negro slaves landed at Jamestown. 1625, Charles I of England. 1626, Sir Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam died. 1643, Louis XIV began his reign of 72 years. 1644, the Manchus ended the Ming dynasty. 1648, Treaty of Westphalia. Thereby Holland and Switzerland were recognized as free republics, and Prussia became important. The treaty gave a complete victory neither to the imperial crown nor to the princes. War of the Fronde, it ended in the complete victory of the French crown. 1649, execution of Charles I of England. 1658, Aurungzeb Great Mogul, Cromwell died. 1660, Charles II of England. 1674, New Amsterdam finally became British by treaty and was renamed New York. 1683, the last Turkish attack on Vienna, defeated by John III of Poland. 1689, Peter the Great of Russia, to 1725. 1701, Frederick I, first King of Prussia. 1707, death of Aurungzeb, the empire of the Great Mogul disintegrated. 1713, Frederick the Great of Prussia born. 1715, Louis XV of France. 1755 to 63, Britain and France struggled for America and India. France in alliance with Austria and Russia against Prussia and Britain, 1756 to 63, the 7 Years' War. 1759, the British General Wolfe took Quebec. 1760, George III of Britain. 1763, Peace of Paris. Canada ceded to Britain, British dominant in India. 1769, Napoleon Bonaparte born. 1774, Louis XVI began his reign. 1776, Declaration of Independence by the United States of America. 1783, Treaty of Peace between Britain and the new United States of America. 1787, the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia set up the federal government of the United States. France discovered to be bankrupt. 1788, First Federal Congress of the United States at New York. 1789, the French States General assembled, storming of the Bastille. 1791, flight to Varennes. 1792, France declared war on Austria. Prussia declared war on France. Battle of Valmy. France became a republic. 1793, Louis XVI beheaded. 1794, execution of Robespierre and end of the Jacobin Republic. 1795, the Directory. Bonaparte suppressed revolt and went to Italy as commander-in-chief. 1798, Bonaparte went to Egypt, Battle of the Nile. 1799, Bonaparte returned to France. He became first consul with enormous powers. 1804, Bonaparte became emperor. Francis II took the title of Emperor of Austria in 1805, and in 1806 he dropped the title of Holy Roman Emperor. So, the Holy Roman Empire came to an end. 1806, Prussia overthrown at Jena. 1808, Napoleon made his brother Joseph King of Spain. 1810, Spanish America became republican. 1812, Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. 1814, abdication of Napoleon, Louis XVIII. 1824, Charles X of France. 1825, Nicholas I of Russia, first railway Stockton to Darlington. 1827, Battle of Navarino. 1829, Greece independent. 1830, a year of disturbance. Louis Philippe ousted Charles X. Belgium broke away from Holland. Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha became king of this new country, Belgium. Russian Poland revolted ineffectually. 1835, the word socialism first used. 1839, Queen Victoria. 1840, Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. 1852, Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. 1854–56, Crimean War. 1856, Alexander II of Russia. 1861, Victor Emmanuel, first King of Italy. Abraham Lincoln became President, USA. The American Civil War began. 1865, surrender of Appomattox Courthouse. Japan opened to the world. 1870, Napoleon III declared war against Prussia. 1871, Paris surrendered in January. The King of Prussia became German Emperor. The Peace of Frankfurt. 1878, the Treaty of Berlin. The armed peace of 46 years began in Western Europe. 1888, Frederick II, March, William II, June, German emperors. 1912, China became a republic. 1914, the Great War in Europe began. 1917, the two Russian revolutions, establishment of the Bolshevik regime in Russia. 1918, the armistice. 1920, first meeting of the League of Nations, from which Germany, Austria, Russia and Turkey were excluded, and at which the United States was not represented. 1921, the Greeks, in complete disregard of the League of Nations, make war upon the Turks. 1922, great defeat of the Greeks in Asia Minor by the Turks. End of chronological table. This is also the end of the book A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. This book was read to you by Christine in Riga, Latvia, April 2020. Thank you for listening.